Hello and welcome to the She Leads podcast, a podcast about women flourishing in the church. Alongside my co-host Dave Bish, we'll be interviewing some of the authors that I've so appreciated and learnt from over the years. In writing this book, I wanted to do two things. Firstly, diagnose a problem in the church, and secondly, help others to feel it. I didn't want to, and so haven't offered solutions. That, I hope, will come through listening to each other. So if you're interested in the future of women flourishing in the church, then listen along. And if you can, join in the discussion.
Hello, and welcome to the She Needs podcast, a podcast about women flourishing in the church. Along with my co-host, Nay, I'm delighted that in this episode we get to meet Eric Schumacher. Welcome to you, Eric. Eric is, many things. He lives in Iowa with his family. He is a songwriter, works in full-time ministry serving other pastors. He's the author of a whole load of different books. He's written Hours, Biblical Comfort for Men Grieving Miscarriage. He's co-authored Worthy and Jesus and Gender with Elise Fitzpatrick. Lots we can say about Eric. We're really glad to have the opportunity to ask him a few questions today. No.
Eric, it's great to have you on our podcast. I first met you, if you remember, a few years ago with the Passion for Evangelism book club. We read your co-authored book, Worthy, and discussed it and had you on a Zoom where we got to ask you questions. And you probably don't remember this, but one question that my friend asked was so significant that it has changed the direction of what She Needs is all about. So a friend of mine said to you, Eric, what do we do? How do we help church leaders understand about women flourishing in the church? And you answered, church leaders are really busy. Don't just come and tell them your ideas. Go and talk to them and tell them how it feels to be a woman in the church. And that alone has shifted the direction. So She Needs isn't giving solutions, it's diagnosing a problem. And that's because of you. So thanks, Eric, before we start.
Well, thank you, Nay. It's I've always appreciated your support and am happy to support you now.
Thanks, Eric. So in particular, we want to ask you about the book Worthy. And first of all, just why did you write the book? Tell us a bit about the book and why you wrote it.
Yeah, so Worthy is, first of all, just sort of a biblical theology, the theme of women in the storyline of the Bible. And so it goes from Genesis to Revelation, looking at how God has used women in the storyline of salvation and their critical place there and their value in God's kingdom. I wrote it because, I had grown up in complementarian spaces, and my theology really hasn't changed much. But there were a lot of things I was hearing and I think subtly believing about women that weren't sitting right with me. And I'd realized that I'd done a lot of study and heard from a lot of favorite teachers and just sort of swallowed what they were feeding me uncritically because they were people I respected. I just believed it. And I wanted to go back through the Bible and just see with fresh eyes, what does the Bible say about women? And so I was in a period of sort of just re-exploring that. And I had written a series of tweets, it was Twitter at the time, on women who were the first humans, first people to do certain things in the Bible. It got turned into an article at the Gospel Coalition. And Elise invited me onto her podcast, Elise Fitzpatrick, to talk about that article and said, you should write a book. And I said, you should write it with me. And a year or so later, Worthy appeared. And so it's been a fun journey ever since.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you later about that blog because, again, that blog has been absolutely critical to me in my thinking. But first of all, why did you co-author it? You could have written it on your own. Elise suggested it. you'd written the blog. Why bother co-authoring it? Because it's hard work, I guess, co-authoring. And in particular, why a woman did you co-author it with?
Well, the answer is going to be less sophisticated than you might think. When when Elise suggested you should write this book, I'd been trying to break into writing for a long time, and what I was hearing from agents and publishers was, "We like your writing, but nobody knows who you are," and so we can't publish you, or we can't place you with a publisher, and so Elise at that time had published like 23, 24 books. And so I said, you should write it with me, simply because I knew if she'd write it with me, it'd get written. And, but I really think, I'm so deeply appreciative to Elise for being willing to take an unknown author like me, who she hardly knew, and said, yeah, let's do this together. Uh, what that what in hindsight that partnership turned out to be valuable was, it had the perspective of a man and a woman. And I think if it was just me writing it as a man, there'd be perspective I would lose, not having Elise partnering with me in it. But there'd also be people who'd say, and maybe rightly so, like, why is a man writing about the place of women in the storyline of the Bible? But at the same time, if it was just Elise, she wouldn't have a male's perspective, but also it'd be one more book written about the value of women by a woman. And we need to hear men saying these things. And for some of our readers, especially women who've been in more abusive or unappreciative church environments, or abusive homes, or or whatnot, we've heard them saying, this is the first time I've ever heard a man saying these things. And so that partnership ended up being very critical and important in how God's used the book.
Yeah, it's a great example, isn't it, of brothers and sisters working together.
Yes.
So just one more question on the book. What really stuck out to you looking at the value of women? What was the one thing that you've just not forgotten when you read the Bible afresh with the lens of looking at the value of women?
Women are everywhere in the Bible, and they're everywhere in critical ways. I mean, from the point where God says it is not good for the man to be alone, I'll make a helper for him. I mean, there's just a reminder that before sin even enters the world, man cannot fulfill God's calling for humanity by himself. He needs her. They need each other. But then through the storyline of the Bible, as we're looking for the birth and the arrival of this Redeemer, there are countless situations where, in hindsight, the line of the Redeemer seems to be threatened. And it's faithful, courageous women who act and are obedient and are faithful, who sort of keep that line going. They preserve that line. And then you see them when you read with fresh eyes, just reading passages looking for women in the New Testament, even in Paul's letters, like they're everywhere, in Acts, in the epistles, partnering with their brothers in furthering the gospel and the work of the kingdom. And it's just beautiful. And once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Eric, and that's what I loved about your book. I just loved Jesus more. And I loved God more because I saw myself in the Bible probably for the first time. So yeah, huge thanks.
Oh, that's great. Eric, in the church I'm part of, we've been spending time thinking through, I guess, kind of what we think in terms of the roles of men and women in the church. I guess partly in terms of how we land theologically, but also thinking about kind of the culture of the church and yeah, how that kind of operates. And you've been a pastor, you work with pastors, so I'd love to just ask you a few different questions about like how you've seen that work out on the ground. So I guess firstly, that you as a man, you've pastored women in your church. How have you done that? How have you seen men do that well? And are there things where I guess you'd think, well, that's well intentioned that you're trying to do the right thing, but that's not a very good idea. Any things you've seen?
Yeah, For me, it was I've always been blessed to have women in the church who are great partners and friends. And but that's not to say that I've always pastored women well. I think there's ways that I have just not been sensitive to or aware of some of the unique aspects of simply being a woman in our culture, where we live, and how that impacts their place in the church, and also just not being aware of the subtle um, cultural aspects that women face in churches that sometimes are very starkly different than what they face in the workplace, and just having conversations and saying, what's it been like for you as a woman to be in the church, have been invaluable to me. And I'll say, as we think about this theologically and as we think about it practically, I'm a very conservative Christian. I serve in the Southern Baptist Convention, in a state convention of Southern Baptist churches. I'm a member of a Southern Baptist church. I've always pastored Southern Baptist churches, and if you've seen anything in the media about Southern Baptists, like we only have male pastors and elders in our church, and that's something I hold by biblical conviction. Um, but part of the process for me was asking the question, okay, what do I believe the Bible teaches here? And then what does it actually teach? Versus what am I extrapolating from that teaching as an implication? And is that implication legitimate? And so what does the Bible allow or prohibit? And then am I prohibiting anything the Bible doesn't? And so if I believe only men should be elders in the church, um, it, that actually, so part of what I did was, what does that say? Like, what is a pastor doing in the worship service versus what any member can do in a worship service? And so suddenly that was going, well, I was always in churches where women read the Bible and they prayed in our service. Um, Suddenly with our music team, as I was a worship leader in our last church, as part of my pastoral role, it was having the women read the leader parts of our liturgy and our responsive readings. And it was a matter of just being aware to say, hey, we're making this decision. We've gotten a lot of feedback, but it's all been from men. What do the women in our church think about this discussion? It's just, at first it was trying to be very intentional about saying, where are the women? Paul assumes in his letter to the Corinthians that you're going to hear the voice of women in the worship service. He speaks about them praying and prophesying. It's the norm that's assumed for him. And he doesn't say, tell them to be quiet. He says, in this culturally appropriate way, here's how they're to dress and speak and so forth. But I'm asking the question then, are we hearing women's voices in our worship service? And I'm trying to be intentional about, are we factoring in both men and women in our decisions as pastoral leaders? And after a time that becomes second nature. After we began having women read the scripture in our service, alternating with men, scripture reading, female worship leaders sharing parts of the liturgy leadership, we started having members who would say, hey, we visited a couple other churches on when we were off on vacation, and we were traveling and out of town, and it stood out to us that we never heard the voice of a woman in worship on Sunday morning, and it felt like something was missing, like the whole body wasn't being represented. And it's startling how uh, accustomed we can become to the absence of women. But when we're intentional about being brothers and sisters together, serving side by side in the church, we can actually become so accustomed to the presence of women that we miss them when they're gone. And I think that's the place we want to be.
Yeah, no, that's really challenging and was really helpful. I think as Worthy was one of the many books that we've read together as a church, and just as you've highlighted the different voices and the expectations that the New Testament sets for us of seeing women's contribution to the life of the church. I guess I've heard some push back against that and say, well, if we celebrate women in the church, then isn't that going to be a negative for the men in the church? I wonder, I don't know, that's necessarily been your experience, but what would you say to someone who's got that kind of concern?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple reasons for that response. Some, I think there's sort of a knee-jerk reaction by conservatives to, in our culture with secular feminism, which has that movement has many waves and has done good things, and there's other things we might push back on depending on your perspective. But sometimes I think we just have this knee-jerk reaction that celebrating women, that must be some type of liberalism that we're entering into, straying for whatever reason, like straying from the truth. And we just react to like highlighting anybody's differences for a lot of reasons that we could explore. But then I also think and maybe it's an excuse and maybe it's a genuine concern, we can say, well, aren't we supposed to be celebrating Christ? And, we're here to worship the Lord. And by celebrating women, that seems to be competing with worshiping the Lord. Or we have this weird idea that we can't celebrate, that to celebrate one means to diminish the other. So if we celebrate women, it automatically means we're devaluing men. And that's just simply not the case. And the proof of that is in creation, before sin has ever tainted the world, when everything is right, we find the Lord presenting the woman to the man, and he sings. It's poetry at the end of Genesis 2. And he's like, at long last, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. He's rejoicing over, he's celebrating this gift of the woman. And we see that celebration in Song of Songs and going both ways between men and women. We are gifts to each other from God. And one of the ways that we glorify God is by celebrating his gifts. If I don't rejoice over the various aspects of a chef's meal, I actually insult the chef. And so celebrating the good gift that women are to us as men, to us as the church, doesn't compete with celebrating the good gift that men are. And it doesn't compete with celebrating the glory of God, because his glory is displayed in his gifts and in his creation, and women are part of that.
Eric, thanks so much. That's so helpful. And we just hope and long that many church leaders will listen along to this, and what you're saying in your book, along with Elise, will influence many. So thank you so much. We talked earlier about a blog that you wrote called 21 Places. It has so inspired me. I've done many, many seminars on raising up female evangelists, and I've used your 21 Places over and over again. And then also, you may remember, we did a whole series last Christmas in Passion for Evangelism called 21 Places, and 21 women read the passage, read your small paragraph, and then responded themselves and wrote a blog on it. And it was just amazing to see women finding themselves in scripture and seeing God's plan for them. So the blog is about 21 places where women emerge front and center in scripture's storyline. And it's so good. There are some that really stood out to me. So women were the first to witness and share right from the cradle to the grave of the good news of Jesus. But I was just wondering, thinking about that blog in particular, why did you write that? And then what impact did you hope it would have on those that read it? Probably you didn't imagine me and my slight obsession with it, but what hope did you have it would have on others?
Yeah, well, I wrote it because the Gospel Coalition invited me to, based on that string of tweets. My hope, I think, in writing it, it's been so long now. You probably know the article better than I do. And I just love what you've been doing with it. I love the work that you're doing, Nay, in encouraging women to be sharing the gospel. My hope was, and I remember the feedback on it. There was people who celebrated it and people who said I was worshiping at the altar of Satan or of feminism. um, it, there was such a mixed response to it, but my hope was to see like just to show like, hey, women are here in the storyline of the Bible. They have active roles. They're and they have really significant roles. They're not just sort of there as a prop, for the men to be highlighted against or alongside. Like they're integral to this storyline. And my hope was to say, I didn't even get into like the whole gender roles discussion or ordination in the church discussion. My hope was to say that regardless of where you fall on those lines, you can't deny how women are, you know, present and sometimes front and center in the storyline of redemption. And we need them to be as present and as visible now as God inspired his Bible to make them in his book.
Yeah. And I think that's why I loved it so much, because there were just so many examples of women doing incredible things. So I don't know if you remember your list. I know it probably off by heart, but can you remember any that really stood out to you, and why was that?
Oh, I wish I'd had homework beforehand. I would have reread the
Sorry, I
article.
should have told you.
I think the one that always stands out to me is that um, Eve is the first person in the Bible to to use the name of Yahweh, to call in the name of Yahweh, and to verbally hers is the first verbal confession of faith. I think we can imply that Adam had faith when he names his wife Eve. He believes she's going to be the father of all the living. They're not going to die right away. God's going to give them grace. But Eve is the one who says, "I've gotten a a son, a male offspring, with the help of Yahweh." She is confessing that God is keeping his promise to have a seed of the woman who will be born. Um, it's really profound theology on the part of Eve, and she has been so villainized, and of course she was a trespasser who, like Adam, disobeyed the Lord and sinned against him, and terrible things flowed from all of that. But she is also like this preeminent woman of faith who trusts the Lord, and she's the first person um, to trust the Lord, uh, to have her confession recorded in the Bible, and so she is just such an example to us of what it means as a mom who, and that confession of faith is reiterated after Abel is murdered and then Seth is born, and she says, "I've gotten, with the Lord, I've gotten another male offspring, another son, to replace Abel." There's so much we could say about that, but here is a woman who has fallen into deep shame through her own sinful choices. She has experienced the painful consequences of her sin. She has a wayward son who has walked away from the Lord. She has a son who's died, and she's still confessing faith in Yahweh to keep his promises. Just simply amazing. And I can't wait to meet her in heaven one day. I just want to have a conversation with her.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you so much. You know, the one I do this in a seminar, and I basically read them out and get women to discuss them and then say which one stands out to you the most. The one that is always stands out the most is number 12. Only women are said to give general, regular financial provision out of their own means to Jesus and the 12. That one by far is just the shocking one. And so thank you for just helping us love the words, God's words through the Bible, and helping us rediscover these just shocking, incredible stories that maybe we thought we knew and we don't. And in turn, that just brings great hope and faith. So yeah, thank you so much for that blog.
Oh, thank you, Nay, for how you're using it, how you're encouraging women. Um, you've served far more people through that article than I have, I think.
No, it's so helpful, Eric. I think the way that you highlight just different women throughout the story of the Bible, and I've been preaching through Mark's gospel in recent months, and just I think kind of helped me to clock, oh yeah, there are these women who are highlighted throughout Mark, and so I've just been in the end of chapter 12 recently, and the poor widow who comes and gives everything that she's got, and it would have been so easy for me just to kind of not even really draw any attention to that at all, not to notice that that was there, and but you sort of changed my kind of the focus in my lenses really in a way that's really helpful, and I think it then helps to serve men and women in the church, which is it's great. Thanks for doing that.
Exploring women in the Gospels is such an amazing thing, because I don't believe there's a single woman who is one of Christ's enemies or opposed to his ministry. They're always helped by him, or they're his helpers, like the women who, from their own finances, support him and his disciples. And all of his enemies are men. Those who collude against him are men. That's not to say that women aren't sinners in need of salvation. They are. But that is to say, when we look at the recorded life of Christ on earth, we're so often suspicious of women in our churches. That can be, in some cultures, that there's just this suspicion of women as the seducers, the deceivers, all those things. But if there's anybody we should be suspicious of through the Gospels, it's the men. And there's such a positive portrait of women in the life of Jesus. It's quite astounding.
One last question for you. Here's our question really for everybody we're speaking to, but what do you think she needs to flourish in the church?
Well, yeah, the obvious answer is Jesus. That's what she needs. She needs the gospel that reminds her that she's made in the image of God, and that though she is fallen into sin and has her own guilt, though she has legitimate shame, and though she has false shame that's been put on her by wrong views of women, though she's been mistreated by sinful people in the world, though she's been sidelined and overlooked, undervalued, we could go on and on with the adjectives there. Though women have experienced all those things, through Christ, God sees women, and he has sent his son to die for them, to bear their sin on the cross. He's been raised from the dead on behalf of his daughters, of his Christ's sisters, who become adopted and into full status as sons. They equal status as heirs in the kingdom of Christ. And not only are they redeemed, but God delights to dwell within her. And not only does God dwell with her and redeem her, but he also is happy to send her with the good news of his kingdom. She needs to be reminded of all of that, both through the proclamation of the gospel and through the application of the gospel, as in the way that she is served and included and sought after and sent out in gospel ministry.
Thank you so much, Eric, for joining us today. We're so grateful for you. So grateful for all of the books you've written. I'm so glad Elise invited you to co-author that first book, and our hope is that this podcast will help many more in turn. So huge thanks for giving us your time and being with us today. Thanks for joining our podcast.
Well, thank you, Nay, and thank you, Dave. It's been great to be here with you.